Today, I want us to think about a value that rises out of the feelings expressed in a letter. And this letter is a letter that we call Ephesians. And Ephesians is a letter that's part of the collection of books that we call the Bible. It was written, we think, around about AD 66. So it's about 30 years after the death and the resurrection of a young Jewish rabbi called Jesus of Nazareth. And we know that his life and his death and his resurrection turned the whole of history around. And another Jewish teacher, a rabbi called Paul, wrote many letters to different communities after his own passionate change to follow the ways of this man, Jesus. Paul was such a pain to the empire of the time, the Roman Empire, that he ends up in prison in various places. And we think about 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, he's writing this letter to a place called Ephesus, writing to encourage these new Jesus followers probably about three major things. To remind them of who their God is, to remind them what their God has done, and then to encourage them and challenge them about the response that they might make. When Paul writes, he doesn't write like a man who is chained, who is trapped, who is locked down by restrictions. He starts his letter with hymns and greetings that are full of the idea of grace and peace. When I say grace and peace at the end of our services, it's because at the end of all of Paul's letters, he says grace and peace, and he often introduces it as well, and it's a theme throughout. And so he starts with poems, with hymns, with songs about the amazing things that their God has done. And for him, this centres around Jesus of Nazareth, a man he calls the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one who's changed everything. Paul's first listeners who would have heard this letter read out are living, in this case, in a city that's famous, actually, for a number of different things. It's a trade route, a centre of a lot of trade routes, but it's actually famous particularly for a cult, for a religion, a goddess. The goddess Artemis, a fertility goddess. And her temple, her main temple is here, and her priests. And the system was based around the idea that you would buy little statues or bigger statues of Artemis. And the more you had, and the more you contributed to the temple and to the system, then the more crops, the more family, the more wives, the more children, the more power, the more status, the more happiness you would have. Now, the trade made the city rich already, but this trade in these statues and in this cult made the city even richer. Status, power, consumption, military force, political power, it's the DNA of the Roman Empire. But instead of finding themselves empowered or informed or free to enjoy the goods and the trade and the services and the experiences that were on offer in this city, instead these people are finding that all this stuff, all this lust for power, all this desire for more experiences is actually catching them up in a trap. They are finding themselves actually oppressed by all of the systems and the machines around them that are actually sucking the joy out of their life. They're addicted. They're addicted to following a way, a path, a system that is actually, according to this story, pulling us away from what it means to be human, getting us addicted to mucking things up. And that's the way that these stories talk about something called sin. As Paul writes, he is excited. He's excited because he describes and he recognises this kind of difficult, awful slavery, this situation, as something that's in the past. He writes, we have been saved. He believes his listeners have been saved. I have a friend who loves it when Christians sometimes talk to him and say, now, when were you saved? Now, when they say that, they mean, when did you become a Christian? It's become a phrase that people use. When were you saved? And he'll joke and he'll say, well, around about 2,000 years ago. Paul would appreciate the joke. Because for Paul, this has happened. It's not something that's possible, it's something that has happened. In his letter, he doesn't say, if you do a certain thing, if you live a certain way, if you buy a certain product, if you become part of a certain religion, then you can be saved. Be sorry. God will reward you if you're only sorry enough. No, instead he says, we were all sinners. But God has saved us through the life and the death and the resurrection, the work, the project God's always been doing of Jesus of Nazareth. He says we were slaves. We were dead to what life was all about, and yet God saved us. That is who our God is, and that is what our God has done. This is grace. And Paul returns to grace time and time again. He says it's by grace you were saved. And when he says you, he means you plural. All of you. All of us. He says we've been saved by grace through faith. And then some would say, well, it's the faith that's important then. That's how you earn being saved. You have to have the faith. But that's not what's in these stories. Instead, faith is described as something not that I do to earn a prize, but as my response to what God has done. Faith is the reaction. I have faith. I put my trust in the fact that God has done this, that God is who I believe he is. I believe, I trust, I have faith that I am loved, that I am forgiven, that I am saved. And my faith, my life is a response, not a way to earn that. God, in all of these stories, in everything that Jesus was about, has done all the work, is doing all the work, has saved his whole creation, rescued us from everything that gets in the way. And our response is when we realise this and put our trust in that God and then try and live out who he made us to be. Faith is joining in. It's not the way in, it's a reaction, it's a response. Grace is from God. And the faith is also from God. It's what we were made for. And we can take no credit. We can't do any boasting. We can only boast about who God is, what he's done, and what he's done through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus and his work in the world around us. Paul writes, for we are God's workmanship. And again, that might seem like a reminder that, well, God made you, so you better do what God wants you to do. But again, the word that he's using is a Greek word that is about workmanship and has the same roots as our word poem. It means craftsmanship, a creation, a work of art, like a sculpture or a song or a poem. That's how God views each one of us. Paul's reminding his listeners in Ephesus, huddling around, trying to push back against a system that's trying to chip away at who they are, that they are each God's work of art, lovingly crafted for a reason. Created to partner with God in his project, to do good works. This was always the plan. Not for slavery, not for oppression, not for consuming things all the time, being part of a machine, but for good works, to be a blessing, a partner in what God is doing in the world. Enabled by his grace. And this was always, always part of the plan, part of the story.